newborn babies have the need to breathe. Otherwise, they would die in a few minutes. Similarly, if adults breathe just twice in the total absence of oxygen, they faint. And if they faint where there is no oxygen, once again, they die within minutes. This testifies to the fact that living beings experience a radical dependence on the world. Without the world, living beings cannot live. Can we imagine life without oxygen on Earth? This can be visualized, for instance, in the Dalal geothermal area in Ethiopia, where there is life in total absence of oxygen. There we can find some types of bacteria that live on hydrogen sulfide. These bacteria produce and accumulate sulfur, as can be seen in the small yellow grains in the picture, right inside the bacteria. These bacteria are microscopic forms of life and can only live in water. Out of water, they would be killed by ultraviolet rays, because globally the absence of oxygen would imply the absence of ozone and the presence of UV rays. At some point during the Earth's evolution, some bacteria developed photosynthesis. These microscopic bacteria started releasing oxygen in the air, and this oxygen has been building up for hundreds of millions of years, up to reaching a sufficient level for the development of other forms of life. Thanks to this long-lasting process of photosynthesis carried out by bacteria, oxygen started accumulating. But what is photosynthesis? It is a light-driven process starting with 6 CO2 molecules that react with 6 water molecules, eventually resulting in a molecule of glucose. A byproduct of this process is oxygen. Then, with oxygen accumulating, there was the development of bacteria able to use this oxygen and burn the organic molecules produced by photosynthetic bacteria. This process is the opposite of photosynthesis and is called respiration. It has made some bacteria much more efficient in producing energy from organic matter. This was the beginning of an explosion in evolution, leading to the development of the so-called eukaryotes, in other words, higher order forms of life. Initially, they were unicellular, but they soon turned into multicellular organisms, such as more complex organisms and decidedly larger forms. What happened then? Some of the bacteria that could perform respiration were incorporated into other forms of life, becoming the mitochondrion, such as the power plant reproducing energy for the rest of the cell of these forms of life. So there are cells that incorporate bacteria able to perform respiration, such as mitochondria, or cells that incorporate bacteria able to perform photosynthesis, such as chloroplasts, that enable also higher organisms to perform photosynthesis. And then there was the development of all the rest of eukaryotic life. The accumulation of oxygen in the air also had another important effect, such as the creation of the ozone layer. You should think of the Earth as surrounded by a thin layer of oxygen, and then in the upper parts of the atmosphere there is an even thinner layer, that is the ozone layer. Why is the ozone there? If there is oxygen, O2, in the atmosphere, this is hit by UV rays from the sun in the upper level of the atmosphere, and it produces ozone, O3. Ozone basically absorbs almost all the ultraviolet radiation, preventing this from reaching the surface of the Earth and sterilizing life. This made it possible for life to emerge from water. Water can screen ultraviolet radiation, but outside of water, life would have been exposed to UV radiation. Ozone screens this radiation, so it made it possible for life to emerge from water and fully conquer dry land. This is how dry land turned from a stone desert into a lush garden, teeming with so many forms of life. We know that the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere has been quite stable for millions of years. Should there be large variation in its oxygen concentration, this would have serious consequences for life. A large increase in oxygen will lead to the risk of widespread combustions and catastrophic fires. Conversely, a strong decrease in oxygen concentration would eventually lead to a reduction of biodiversity, as many living beings could not survive lower oxygen concentrations. How can this oxygen concentration be maintained in the air? We used to think this was due to rainforests. Obviously, big forests do produce a lot of oxygen. However, most oxygen produced there is consumed inside the forest itself, and it is consumed by animals or by the decomposition of all the organic matter building up in these forests. Atmospheric oxygen, to a large extent, is produced by phytoplankton. That means all those organisms living in the ocean, such as algae, cyanobacteria, and other forms of life performing photosynthesis. These can release oxygen and multiply because they are constantly fed with nutrients. This constant mixing of nutrients is the result of several factors, from ocean currents to glaciers grinding part of the land surface, to rainfall washing away part of rocks. All this contributes to supplying nutrients, one more evidence of the dependence of living beings on the world, and on the other hand, of the preservation of life as we know it today. So, everything works in unison to be able to preserve oxygen in the air as we know it. All these things testify that life is at one time totally dependent on the world, but also radical diversity with respect to the world. What are the features of this radical diversity? And the first one is the most evident one. Without this feature, there could be no life at all. And this feature is the presence of a membrane. And the membrane is a distinguishing feature of life. It is a kind of thin film surrounding every existing cell. We can think of cells without a cell wall, something that may further contain the cell. We can think of cells that are deprived of the wall and remains alive, but there is no living cell that can be deprived of its membrane. It is a sort of extremely thin foil, something like around 1/1000th of a meter, fully surrounding the cell. And if we consider that even the thickness of a simple bacterium is 1 micron, that is 1/1000th of a meter, this means that the membrane can be around 1,000th of the thickness of a bacterium. So a very small fraction of a bacterium, a living cell. The membrane is extremely thin, but it is also a crucial point of energy, matter, and information exchange. Somehow, the membrane isolates the cell, but at the same time, it is a mediator linking the cell to the external world. Inserted into the membrane, there are many proteins enabling this exchange of matter, energy, and information. Let's take a simple cell, a bacterium. Have a look inside and consider only complexity of its composition. Even in the bacterium, we can find billions of molecules, excluding water, which is obviously the most abundant component. There is about 1 billion of molecules, and these molecules are distributed among thousands of different species. There are ions, proteins, organic acids, DNA, RNA, and many other different things. Some of them in large quantity, others in smaller amounts, and others might just be present as individual molecules in each cell. Moving to a more complex structure, let's take a eukaryotic cell. For instance, the yeast we use to ferment beer or bread. This yeast is 5 times larger than the bacterium, and it has greater complexity, as there are about 600 billion water molecules and several billions of ions, lipids, and all the other things mentioned before. By all means, there is no comparison between the great complexity inside the cells with what can be found in inanimate matter. Moving on to a higher degree of complexity, let's take a cell of our body, the cell of a mammal. The cell is 4 to 5 times bigger than that of yeast. It includes 200 billion ions, 100 billion lipids, 10 billion proteins, and so on. So there is a further increase in complexity. If just one of these components, for instance DNA base or an apparently insignificant component, is modified, sometimes the whole system may run the risk of collapsing in a short time. And the cell can maintain such an incredible complexity because it constantly self-reproduces. It reproduces its own components and renews them in a way to preserve its complexity, as clarified in the first section of the exhibit. Let's now take a look inside one of these cells, for example, a yeast cell. As we said, this cell is a sort of bag full of different molecules. Going into more details can be seen in this picture, you can immediately understand that it is not just a bag full of disorganized molecules. It is an extremely complex mix, but it is highly organized internally, with many different compartments, each one organized in its own, mutually interacting and constantly exchanging matter and energy among each other. Therefore, the cell has a profound organization and cooperation of the different components according to strongly hierarchical patterns. Let's now consider a unicellular alga. It looks like a quite complex system as well. We can recognize a large chloroplast with its folded membranes where photosynthesis occurs and where starch accumulates. There are the nucleus, the vacuoles, several membrane systems that constantly develop, merge, and migrate within the cell. And it is clear that this level of complexity applies to the subcellular level. The cellular level and can also apply to the level of multicellular organisms, of cooperation between various cells, up to a higher degree of complexity where it applies to the interaction between living beings within the same species and also between different species. You must begin out in the open sea. That's where you start on a small scale and put yourself in shape for loftier achievements. As is the case of individual cells, organisms made of many cells, metazoans, are also involved in the dichotomy between seeking isolation and establishing relations with their environment and their organisms. A spectacular example can be found in the most ancient animals, for instance sponges. These Precambrian oceans 1 billion years ago. They firstly appeared then. Their outermost layer is covered with flat cells, isolating them from the environment. Their surface is bristling with spicules, protecting them from predators, but they are also perforated with an infinite number of small openings. The scientific name of sponges is porifera, meaning pore bearer. Pores allow water to circulate inside the sponges for feeding. In this way, there is a constant relationship, and there is a continuous research of compromise between isolation from and relation with the environment. Sponges do not just isolate from the environment by means of the porous epithelium they are covered with. They also produce and release a wide range of chemical substances against predators, bacteria, and viruses. This repertoire of diversified substances has been inherited by cnidarians, another extremely ancient group. The reef, represented in this picture, is from Western New Guinea. We can see some colonies of Polythoa polyp. Polythoa polyps produce polytoxin, one of the most complex and toxic organic molecules in the world. Thanks to polytoxin, these polyps can defend themselves from any possible enemy and competitor. These molecules do not have just a defensive purpose. They are also used for communication. For example, in this slide, you can see barnacles that can be commonly found on rocky coasts. These barnacles shown in the picture are from the Ligurian Sea in northern Italy. Barnacles attract their larvae by means of protein-based substances which are continuously released by adults in the water. This is how they signal that the environment can be favorable, so favoring the larval settlement near the adults. This kind of communication, enabling organisms to live together, shows unexpected properties. This beautiful anemone is called Anthoplare Ligantissima. Extensive aggregation of this can be found in the British coast along the Channel. In Anthoplare, we can see the early warning pheromone. That is the first molecule released to warn the entire group. When one of the anemones is being predated by a mollusk, the substance is immediately released in the water. The pheromone is perceived by all the others, even the faraway ones, so their tentacles are retracted into the oral disc, preventing the attack of predators. Certainly, the environment modulates the dynamic compromise between isolating from the environment and relating with the external world. In highly populated reefs, the attempt to isolate is extremely powerful and also absolutely necessary. And conversely, in the largest three-dimensional environment of the world, that is the water column, competition is less severe. Therefore, animals tend to incredibly extend their size and the ramifications of their outmost layer to be able to retrieve the largest part of substances from water. For instance, consider this beautiful jellyfish that was photographed in the water of Norwegian fjords. This is really beautiful jellyfish and is from the Mediterranean, for instance. This is a different one. And this jellyfish from the Mediterranean clearly shows how the body of animals also acquires in a 3D space the ability to collect food from all directions. There are even animals that are rooted to the seabed. For instance, like this wonderful deep-water gorgonian. And this is a really special ability, this one of getting things from all directions. And again, these seabed-rooted animals, like this beautiful deep-water gorgonian, is called Laridogorgia, and its stunning development follows a spiral shape in a three-dimensional space to be able to maximally occupy the available space and obtain exchanges with the external environment in the most efficient way. Life in free water offers extraordinary possibilities in this respect. Probably the oldest way to obtain feeding is that still used by the polyps of some corals. This is the Mediterranean precious coral. Its polyps have 8 tentacles characterized by 2 series of expansions, so that it can maximize the uptake of dissolved organic substances that are in the water. So the absorption of what is dissolved in the water is a typical feature of animals that can get food from the water column. And not just food, but also they rely on the exchange of respiratory gases. This is the branchial crown of a polychaetal bristle worm. This extraordinary crown has a diameter of about 10 centimeters, and it is used to filter water and breathe at one. What we have seen is not only an issue for individual organisms, it also has incredible implications that can be even more complex and often hard to interpret at community level. We can see this, for instance, in the highly populated communities of coral reefs. This picture is from the northern peninsula of Sulawesi Island in Indonesia. Each colored spot represents a sponge of a different species. You can see how populated this environment can be. All the species compete with each other for a portion of surface or expand their body. Talking about terrestrial animals, we're familiar with the concept of territory. For these marine animals, the territory coincides exactly with the surface of their body. For this territory, these animals are in fierce competition. What you can see is the dynamic result of a continuous competition. There are sponge species that are specialized to recognize other species on the basis of the chemical substances they release. Remember that before we mentioned communication. The larvae perceive these substances, settle on the sponge from which they could perceive the chemical substance, and slowly they kill it. They cover it, and literally they end up occupying all the space left. This is an extremely selective action based on the highly specific communication used by this species to find free space in densely populated reefs. Probably the most spectacular case can be found in the Mediterranean. This picture is from the cliff of Portofino near Genoa in Italy. In the background you can see the purple sea Paramyricea clavata, typical of the underwater environment of Portofino. In the foreground you can see the strange yellow polyps that have partially covered one of these corals. Those yellow polyps are parasites. They cannot build their own skeleton. Rather, they settle on top of the Gorgonian corals. They kill them and, as in a horror movie, they slowly cover their skeleton. They use the bones of Gorgonians to sustain their body. It could be seen as the extreme horror level of intraspecific relationships. However, in a remote area of New Guinea, we have found a case that is somewhat similar but also incredibly different. In this case, the polyp is similar to the one we saw in Portofino. It covers another colonial organism. You can see its pinnate ramifications. Yet, the epibiont polyp does not cover it completely. It only grows on the main branches. Therefore, the host organism at the basis grows and develops not to be covered by the epibiont. Individually, the two animals are very small, just a few centimeters high. On the other hand, when they live together, they form a sort of chimeric organism, a large fan more than a meter high, in which the two partners can filter water much better than they could do individually. And so they create this fan-like shape, and they work and live out like partners. Together, they can filter water much, much better, as if they could do individually. So we moved from a case of hard parasitism with the polyps in Portofino to another case, a case of mutuality, in which two animals get together in an almost equal relationship. So they get together, and together they build up a united organism that is more successful. An outstanding example in this respect is this extraordinary sponge living in Indonesian reefs. The tissues of this sponge are white and can be clearly seen in this picture. But those kinds of pink veins inside the sponge tissues are a coralline alga that remains alive inside the tissue of the sponge, providing it with a skeleton as it grows. The algae can live on its own. It creates tufts where the larvae of the sponge can settle. The developing sponge forces the algae to grow inside the body of the sponge itself, providing it with a skeleton. Apart from the mere description we can provide as zoologists, at biochemical and genetic level, it would be really interesting to understand what molecules are used by the two partners to exchange signals. And also, it would be very interesting to understand which genes are modulated to determine the growth of the algae in such an incredible way. Cooperation phenomena binding different animals in the marine environment have produced an impressive amount of speciation phenomena, with new species linked to particular environments, such as life on the body of another organism. In this picture, you can see two examples. On the left side is a shrimp, and on the right side is a crab. They live on the colonies of two species of Anthoplarians in the Pacific Ocean. Their mimicry is absolutely extraordinary and absolutely perfect. These animals are specialized to live only on that kind of coral. Consider that there are hundreds of coral species, each with its own shrimps and crabs. A unique example is this tiny seahorse. It is the Hippocampus bargibante, one of the smallest fish species present in the oceans all over the world. It is just 2 centimeters in size. It is a microscopic seahorse living with its tail attached to these red gorgonians. See how incredible the epithelium of this seahorse can be. It has the same color pattern of the hosting coral. But it also shows some fleshy excrescences and outgrowths that mimic gorgonian polyps in an extraordinary and amazing way. And Gorgonia has 8 tentacles, and you can see the 8 marks of the tentacles that they mimic. These relationships do not involve only primitive animals such as sponges and corals and so on. Look at this case, as it is really outstanding. Throughout the Indo-Pacific, there exist burrowing shrimps. These digging shrimps make burrows in all their life and take the sediment outside. And these shrimps are blind. But when they are outside their burrow, they find a way to protect themselves. They live together with a goby, which stays there in front of the burrow like a watchdog. And the shrimps lay their long antennas on the fish. And it is clear in the picture. When the goby spots an enemy, it retreats into the burrow and the shrimp immediately follows through. Consider there are tens of shrimp species living together with tens of goby species. This is probably one of the most well-known cases of a symbiotic relationship. This is the anemone together with its clownfish. I want to show you this example because it is one of the few cases in which the involved pheromones have been identified. The pheromones attract the clownfish into the sea anemone. It has been experimentally demonstrated that there is a whole range of chemical substances able to direct clownfishes towards the anemone. We have seen a series of examples showing that competitive and cooperative relationships are two extremes of a continuum. It's a single trend. It's like two sides of the same coin. And I think that the role played by these relations in the history of life on the Earth has been largely underestimated. Consider that evolutionary theories especially focus on negative relations like competition and predation, while cooperative relations play a role that has yet to be explained to a large extent. I believe Lynn Margulis was right when she wrote in the 80s that life has spread over the globe, not combating and fighting, but cooperating. May I add a last point? Because of this type of relations, biodiversity is likely to tend to the infinite. I will give you an example. Let's look at this polyp through a scanning microscope. It is 1.5 millimeters in size. On its trunk, on the left side, there is that beautiful forest of diatoms, siliceous microalgae, which are some tens or perhaps hundreds of microns in size. If we look in between the algae, in the undergrowth, there are other diatoms, like these ones that have a ladybug shape. And between each diatom, there are microbial mats. In short, cooperative relations have induced a number of speciation phenomena that make biodiversity tend to the infinite, or at least to the limits of the expression of living beings. So biodiversity tends to an infinite level. And so there are many limits of expression of living beings. In the living being, a name also emerges forcefully. It can be seen in these amoeba aggregating, getting together. You see a small slug composed of a few thousands of a cell is created, and then it can start to migrate. And eventually this little slug stops and builds up a fruiting body. It beats a stalk with spores on the top. These spores clearly serve the purpose of propagating the species. In a dry environment, amoeba alone would die. However, once the spores have been formed, they can resist even in the absence of humidity. This life cycle is very short, 24 hours. Amoeba aggregate, migrate together as a multicellular body, and make a fruiting body with its stalk and spores. And the purpose of all this is to enable the propagation of the species. Therefore, the living being always appears to be making an attempt to affirm itself, to survive, to propagate within a non-living, inert world. This is even more visible in seeds. Here are some radish seeds that have been planted. You can see them growing as days are passing. Then at one point they start blossoming. And with flowers comes their reproduction and the creation of a new seed. So the cycle of this living being can start again. The aim is evident. So the aim is evident in every development and regeneration process of many species. Even more so in their ability and tendency to reproduce. There is, for instance, the development of quite diverse forms and functions for the same organism. Sometimes these are developed to constrain the environment, to try to counter environmental changes, to survive despite sudden changes. Different routes may be taken depending on the conditions that could be more or less favorable. Let's consider, for example, two halves of the same potato. These are genetically identical. One is placed in the dark and the other under the light. The one in the dark produces a plant that is slender and tall, without leaves and yellowish, whereas the one under the light does not grow as much in terms of height, but it has bigger leaves and is green because it produces chlorophyll. This is even more evident in some flowers. There is a clear difference in the size and color of the plant. Development can follow different routes with very different outcomes. But it is always the same living being that goes through these processes. The complexity and aim of living beings emerge powerfully during the development and reproduction processes. This is clear from the fact that initially there is one single cell. Then, subsequent cell divisions and multiplications can lead to organisms like humans that have 10,000 billion cells. If we take a simpler organism like a small fly, it has nonetheless thousands of cells. All of them derive from an individual cell, and basically all these cells contain the same genome. Despite such a great diversity in form and function and in multicellular and unicellular organisms, in each of these cells we can find all the features that were to be present in the initial cell that was at the origin of all the other cells and organisms. For example, we have mentioned the separation from the world, such as the presence of a membrane, and connected to this, individuality. Then the aim and cooperation among the different components at cellular level. Consider the DNA, the RNA, the proteins, and all the other cellular components that are organized and cooperate with each other to achieve this aim. Then there is the ability to act and feel the environment, and further to develop and reproduce. Now, having all these features, we can say that on the one side, the living being is totally dependent on the external world. However, at the same time, to be able to live and reproduce, it is also radically other with respect to the inorganic world. There is yet an enormous gap between what could be the most complicated mixture of molecules we might think of and a living organism where we find complexity, coordination, and interaction among all these elements and components. That is, we can find organicity, something that only belongs to the organisms.